immigration arguments being made by the left, you look at their sources. They say Cato Institute, Cato Institute, Cato Institute. So yeah, it's really changed. They're like, yeah, Cato Institute says immigrants are very good for the economy, and then they rely on like guys like what's his name, Alex now Nareste, I think that's how you pronounce his name, that are libertarians. And same with criminal justice stuff. They get a lot of libertarians to talk about how mass incarceration is costing taxpayers a lot of money and is anti-freedom.
Yeah, I
And
remember
those are like
libertarian named Radley Balco, who back around.
yeah. I was just thinking about him actually.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? He sounds like he could be kind of on the young, or the kind of newer school defund the police left.
Well, I mean but the only difference between Balco and the leftists is that Balco is pro-market. So like it is all about the markets.
Right. I mean, they would not like so much experiments in private policing and other things.
Right. But here's the thing though. Leftists, as I said, the left doesn't really care about markets anymore. That's the thing. Like I think remember Brian Kaplan, he was like, "Oh, the left is anti-market and the right is anti-left." But I disagree with him on that. Maybe it was true 20 years ago.
Yeah, I
think the left doesn't really care about markets anymore.
He said that about 14. Well, yeah, about I was going to say 14 years ago, more like 2014. He was saying that the early 2010s, and back then I think it was true because this was around the time of Occupy, and so the left had a very kind of overt political economic orientation. And now it's white supremacy, settler colonialism, transphobia.
So the left is no longer anti-markets, but the right is still anti-left.
The only people still holding it down for like kind of pure political economy, kind of a economistic driven worldview are the old school Marxists and the libertarians, who are of the I love the market but not hate the government variety. Because you could libertarians would maybe kind of an Alex Jones style or Gadsden flag waving. They just hate government. They're not particularly in love with how markets work and kind of digging into all of that and the role that price signals play or anything like that. So you have a kind of an economistic Marxist left who are kind of their eyes at everything being culture war.
Right. I talk about this in my in a piece I'm writing for American Affairs about how the old coalition of libertarians and social conservatives was held together by the Cold War. Once the Cold War was over, they didn't really need to ally on much. And it was a sort of weird alliance, like the whole National Review thing. Like William F. Buckley basically shaped conservatism for almost the entirety of the Cold War era. And now that that's gone, of course things had to realign. They didn't have the USSR or communist China to really kind of define themselves against. And that's why I think the whole market thing changed too, because capitalism was the ultimate anti-Marxist thing. And now that Marxism isn't really a thing to fight against anymore, they kind of started pushing more redistributionist ideas into the right, because it's no longer, oh, you're a commie if you do this, if you do that. It's no longer a thing.
Yeah, there was a piece by Richard Hanania, who is he's not like a libertarian of the kind of 2000s variety that I'm speaking to, but he, somewhat, kind of a full-throated neoliberal, and he said that that essentially America's diversity is even though it creates some of this lack of social cohesion on the ground and it creates problems of trust, it has kept the economy strong and absolutely decidedly anti-Marxist thoroughly. And so he actually celebrates it, which does kind of sound like an old school classical liberal celebrating diversity, because if we're not bonding over religion, we're simply trading with each other. It's kind of
it's not the benevolence of the butcher or the baker. It's that old Adam Smith. that old Adam Smith line where it's like, well, yeah,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
we cooperate not because we're friendly, but because we want money.
There's a kind of sacrifice of social cohesion that some of these people on the right are willing to admit occurs, but oddly, it's wedded. Their defense of it is wedded to America's role as a global hegemon, and we need that kind of purely transactional kind of base society to make us wealthy enough to be hegemonic. And if that means some people on the ground who are sort of vulnerable to the lack of social cohesion and lack of trust that can occur in such a liberal society, if they're going to suffer, then so be it. The fact is that the very self-directed right people can better organize resources under capitalism. That's the thing that matters. So it's kind of there's kind of a new great man theory on the right that's just going in that sort of direction, I'm noticing. So I think there used to be a kind of I don't know if you're familiar with Julian Simon and this kind of sunny humanistic democratic capitalism that or support for that kind of idea that I recall on the right. And there's a kind of new Nietzschean kind of sour great man thing going on the right that does not particularly have any care for the small business person up against the forces of regulation, because as far as they're concerned, the people behind those forces of regulation represent superior individuals in both the public and private sector. So I think the influence of kind of despite me being atheistic and all of that, I think that there have been some bad developments because of that. And I think this kind of overt Machiavellianism and kind of James Burnham style defense of power for power's sake, I see that as a kind of a bad development.
You're talking about the whole Sohrab Ahmari kind of Adrian Vermeule kind of big government conservatism, common good conservatism. You're talking about that kind of thing?
Well, no, because those people are actually religious, so those are kind of trad-cap people. But there's a kind of Nietzschean neoliberal thing.
You're talking about the whole Bronze Age perverts, Bronze Age pervert.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Kind of thing. You're talking about more like Bronze Age pervert, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, Curtis Yarvin, Richard Hanania, maybe some of the people around Palladium Mag. So there's this kind of reorientation on of the right to get away from kind of the yeoman Jeffersonian person on the ground.
Right. It's like a neoliberalism, you'd say.
Right. It ends up becoming an actual caricature of the celebration of beautiful, powerful people that the left has said the libertarian right has always really been about. I think that actually is coming into play now, coming into focus.
Right. Hang on. About the Journal Critical Review. I'm actually looking at it right now. It's does it have a certain political bent to it?
Yeah, it's sort of a classical liberal gadfly kind of journal. The guy who got that underway, founded that, Jeffrey Friedman, he actually died in last couple years, year and a half. And it's kind of a non-natural rights. He's an epistemic kind of libertarian, and yeah. So, but he has organized people around the journal who are maybe as left as it gets, some kind of socialist, but they've been, he basically has that kind of a classical liberal point of view, but it's very far from dogmatic, and yeah, I guess that's how I would explain that.
How do I subscribe to it? Because it looks interesting.
I don't know. I think they mainly do what institutional subscriptions, or if you want to pay out of pocket, it might.
Wait, I see it. It's $31 for a year. Okay.
Well, you're young in school or something, right? Or even if you're not.
Yeah.
Even if you weren't, I think you're at the age where they'd love to just give you a bunch of free copies if you want it. I have a bunch sitting around now, but
wait, yeah, it's $30 per issue, so it's So it's $112 per $112 for a year. That's
You could probably reach out to Stirna Friedman.
We can talk about that after. Okay, yeah.
Just, name a few that you want, maybe 2 or 3 issues, and just be polite about it. You should probably just send.
Do you read the Hedgehog review, by the way?
The what?
The Hedgehog review.
I haven't seen it in a while. I've heard of it. Is it kind of philosophical? Or?
It's also one of those. It's more of a heterodox kind of cultural commentary. It's one of those, like, they publish Michael Lind. They publish like just like people in the realignment sphere. But it's more cultural than it is like if American Affairs was kind of like a more economic focus, then Hedgehog Reviews is kind of like the cultural counterpart to American Affairs, you could say.
American Affairs is interesting. Aren't they pretty politically economic oriented? They talk about industrial policy a lot. And...
Yeah, that's what I said. If Economic Affairs is the economic, then Hedgehog Review is kind of like the social of the sphere, basically, of like extremely highbrow commentary, heterodox commentary.
Yeah, the sad truth is, in the last maybe a year and a half or so, I mainly just Twitter and Substack. I might go to some kind of outbound link on Twitter, but all the online magazines and a long list of such great outlets, I don't go directly to them that often anymore.
Right. I think some of them are worth going to.
I do prefer the kind of longer form stuff. Like I used to look at Spiked a lot. Remember that?
Right. I remember that. But I'm trying to get away from short form stuff. Like I try to avoid going on Twitter too much, because it's just not good. It's just not good for a person's development, for a person's intellectual development, to see takes just like, and it's always like there's always some kind of issue of the day where people talk about like maybe a viral TikTok or some viral TikTok, and people talk about it for like 2 days and they move on. Like I'm not. It's exhausting, and then there's a lot of research that shows it heavily negatively impacts your mental health. So yeah, so I'm using Twitter more as a way to DM people. I hardly ever scroll anymore, and that's why when I tweet something, I don't reply to people. I just tweet it, and then I just leave Twitter.
Yeah, I learned a while ago to just to let people have the last word, or you're just going to be there all day, and so
right, like I'm going to my Twitter profile right now. I have 449 posts. Other people I know, they have like they have like 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 posts, and it's like,
I have a horrible amount by now. Of course, I got on there like 2010, and I used to tweet for my job, and that would be about.
You only have like 40K posts, which if you divide that, it's not that much.
Oh, really? Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Lately I've just been doing
if you thought you were bad, other people are far worse. So
yeah, it's funny. I created a Twitter bot years ago before Musk came on, and sometimes when I get a post that you may notice only gets 1 like, that's actually from my own bot that I commandeer and I don't like it. Yeah, I will like my own stuff, but somewhat clandestinely. But now, if I were to try to make that Twitter bot, it would cost like thousands of dollars. But it was grandfathered in from pre-Musk. So.
So yeah. Apparently, I can read critical review for free online. I can just read it all online. But they just want to charge you for the print. I see.
Oh, well, I didn't know that.
Well.
Send that to me if you send.
I'm looking at Taylor and Francis online.
Oh, do you have some kind of subscription through an institution?
Hang on. Let me see if it's just one article I was able to access, or can I access all articles?
I don't know. maybe Taylor Francis has some deal with
Read.
that. You're going through Taylor
Oh
Francis.
wait. I see. It's only old articles. It's only some old articles where they allow you to see everything.
Well, the
Like
journal
not for an issue.
goes back to like the mid '80s, and they cover a lot of stuff. I mean, it's not all it's not
For
all.
example, I'm seeing this article called "Post-Truth and the Epistemological Crisis." It looks interesting, so I'm going to read it after we're done with my call. With our call.
If you find the one, there is like a symposium or debate on Brian Kaplan's "The Myth of the Irrational Voter," or rational irrationality, kind of getting at that whole idea. That was a pretty good one. I was involved a little bit in that, kind of looking over, reviewing.
Right, that was in 2008, right? It's called
Right. Yeah.
Still Impossible After All These Years. Reply to Kaplan. Oh, wait, that's about socialism. Never mind. Hang on. Critical review.
Yeah, Jeffrey Friedman's main rebuttal to the notion of rational irrationality was that people were, acknowledging some kind of economic trade-off in their head and deciding it's still worth it to behave politically. And Jeffrey Friedman was asserting much more epistemic ignorance than that. And you can't assume that people are thinking like an economist and then deciding to reject economistic thinking. No, we're cultural creatures, and we have messages that are kind of omnipresent and delivered, and they kind of shape somewhat incoherent views on things. It's not because
I mean, the thing about Kaplan is that
kind of right-wing economic. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The thing about Kaplan is that he is very economic focused. Like he's very Apollonian. He doesn't really care about, I guess, the Dionysian side of things. He's he's like I met him, right? Like I met him once at an event he was doing in New York City, where he was debating somebody, and then he was like, if anyone wants to come and join me for lunch beforehand, you can. So I met him there, and he was like, well, so what do you do? I'm like, I study religion, and then I started talking to him a little bit of it, and he started talking about, and then he started like making an argument that was like, believing in religion is not rational because of something blah blah something. I forgot what he said, and I'm just like, it's not all about rationality, and then I was talking to him about his book Open Borders. I was like, well, so you see this part and that part and that part. Well, I think some humans can't accept it because of some feelings they have. And he's like, that doesn't really matter. He hand waves a lot of like that kind of thing. That's the impression I got of him just from meeting him once.
Yeah, it's kind of a dilemma because on the one hand, you could say, well, if everyone thought like Brian Kaplan, maybe the kind of economistic way of thinking could work, but most don't, and maybe I'm predisposed to thinking like him, but if I acknowledge that most people don't, how fruitful is that as a worldview? So then you end up your own rationality down because most people are non-rational.
Yeah, it's like the whole rationalist versus post-rationalist kind of debate in Silicon Valley. It's like what does it matter to even be rational? Even if you accept the postmodern framing that there's multiple ways to be rational, why does rationality still matter? It's so these are all debates, and I think the Hedgehog review, that's basically what they did an entire issue on. I mean no, the critical review. I mean, I see that they did a whole issue about rationality and what it means.
Yeah, Jeffrey Friedman wrote a book called The Rational Choice Controversy, where he's basically saying that, a lot of the there is a kind of so on the one hand, it's kind of a caricature that the right is the kind of the old kind of pre-Trump think tank right is very economistic, and they assert homo economicus, but they really do in fact do that a lot, and that's something that Friedman wrote about in The Rational Choice Controversy, and you see that as a theme. A recurring theme in his rebuttals to economists on the right, kind of libertarian or Austrian public choice influenced. Public choice is a kind of economics that he criticizes for assuming selfish outcomes on the part of people in government. And Friedman at one point went through a lot of the budgets of governments and saw that they had not in fact been inflated, and people were not in fact taking advantage of everything that they could while working in government. So he kind of showing that public choice theory, as far as predicting inflated budgets and waste often did not occur. And so he said they have a wrong model. So I still think public choice is kind of compelling. So I may not be as far in the direction of kind of jettisoning right-wing economistic thinking. I wouldn't go as far as Friedman would, but he did kind of open my eyes to the ideology at work in Milton Friedman style theorizing. You know?
Well, here's the thing. I don't actually think that like these new conservatives reject right-wing economic thinking. They do say it works. It's just that it's actually not good for people. Like if you listen to like Patrick Deneen, right? He says liberalism failed because it has succeeded. As in liberalism was successful, you know, economic liberalism did really result in this, you know, all this capital and all that, you know, neoliberalism did work, but that's kind of also
a victim of our own
what?
success. Yeah.
Yeah, but why fail? This idea that the end result of neoliberalism is a society.
Hello?
Hello? Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay.
All right. So
you got cut off with Adrian Vermeule. You want to start from there?
I actually didn't say Adrian. Oops! I just pressed to react. No. I said Patrick Deneen, not Adrian Vermeule. Right.
All right.
So I was like, you know, Patrick Deneen's idea that liberalism failed because it worked too well, and to a certain extent, he's basically saying like, oh yeah, well, our the individual should not just be allowed to like have this sort of total liberation, which is the end goal of liberalism. The end goal of you know what we should do is reorient things toward a common vision, a common good. So liberalism is successful in the sense that it does produce enormous amounts of capital, but at the same time, it also atomizes people, atomizes communities, and has a whole set of harmful side social effects and creates a lot of inequality, economic inequality. And so that's why liberalism is a victim of kind of its own success. So these new conservatives do say, yeah, you know, capitalism does work, but capitalism doesn't work in our interests, which is the interest of the common good. And that's the distinction between, I would say, the old National Review right and the whole post-liberal right about capitalism. Not that capitalism isn't a driver of economic success, because it absolutely is, but because capitalism itself comes under question, especially laissez-faire free market capitalism.
Right, but I don't think the trad cap though ever assumed homo economicus. So the kind of Milton Friedman types were saying the capitalism works, and they were assuming kind of homo economicus. The Austrians, you can't quite pin homo economicus or kind of monetary consideration first and foremost, or you can't pin that on them the same way you can with like the Chicago school, but that's kind of getting into the weeds. But yeah, so you know you have the tradcaths on the right. They've interestingly imported a kind of a European conservatism or older form of conservatism that
right. They're big like Viktor Orban fans.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I think what was it, the 1850s with the Know Nothings who were critical of European immigrants who worship the Pope coming into the U.S.
Right. That was a big thing. Yeah.
Patrick Deneen would be their worst nightmare. All these people, Sarab Amari and whatnot.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting. Where it's like a lot of the people who support that kind of vision aren't of I guess like Anglo-Saxon background. You know, it's like Irish Catholics like Patrick Deneen, or you know, guys like Sohrab Ahmari. And I mean, it does kind of make sense because liberalism was founded out of a sort of Anglo-Protestant tradition.
Yeah, if you just think of the individualism inherent to so much Protestantism, I mean, even the notion that
Right.
an
It all
individual.
comes from like John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and a bunch of French guys, Rousseau, Voltaire. It's mostly like an Anglo-French thing, and then it kind of spread.
Well, the link between well, you're putting Max Weber aside and all that. I know that he wrote a lot about that, but kind of individualism and Protestantism, just the very notion that you can't, somebody has to come to Jesus on their own. They can't be forced to. Kind of shows that individual voluntary is kind of at the heart of Anglo thinking. That in a way I don't think it is for Catholics, or rather.
That is exactly what I read about in my American Affairs piece. So be sure to subscribe to get it in the next issue. This idea that the whole Protestant, liberal, Catholic, post-liberal, that sort of analogy completely makes sense once you consider that the fact that those are kind of rooted in those two traditions, and that like all political concepts are secularized theological concepts, to quote quoting this guy that Vermeer was a big fan of, Carl Schmitt, who by the way is a very interesting figure, because I've seen more and more people on the left start quoting Schmitt themselves too, talking about how like
Zizek was a big fan of Schmitt, and before around 2015, 2016, most people talking to you about Carl Schmitt would probably be on the left, but now he's just kind of in vogue all across the spectrum, except among liberals, of course.
Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense, because liberalism, in the 1990s, it was liberalism. We win, we won the Cold War. We had fascists, communists, and liberals, and the liberals all won. And now we're going to end history, and it didn't happen. And that's why we're kind of seeing Carl Schmitt have that resurgence, because he represents this kind of, liberalism doesn't really work because of such and such. Although he did change his mind near the end of his life, but that's a different story. So yeah, so like a professor at the theological school I study at, she wrote a book about like how Carl Schmitt's theory of political theology can be used to tackle climate change. And she's like a very left-wing professor. So yeah, so like all these people talk about Carl Schmitt. We see all this leftists talk about him. We see all the right-wingers talk about him, So I think that as liberalism kind of breaks down over the next couple of decades or so, we're going to see a lot of Schmitt discussion. And what's funny, I guess not funny, but like what's interesting is that like Carl Schmitt is massive in China. Like, if you're a prominent Chinese political theorist, you will probably be quoting Carl Schmitt. And it makes a lot of sense if you consider like how well Schmitt's work is suited to the sort of government that China wants.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, there was an essay in First Things called "Why China Loves Conservatives" that talks about this a bit, and it talks about like Huntington, Leo Strauss as well.
Yeah, how to even determine if someone is actually on the left or right is becoming much more complicated, because there's so much criteria being fed into both buckets, into both categories.
Here's my definition of left and right. A left winger is somebody who strives for equity, and a right winger is someone who strives for hierarchy. Well, not strives, but believes is the natural state of nature. That a left winger believes that everyone should be equal in terms of equity. Like there shouldn't be any difference. So leftism, so communism is leftist because it says that people should be equal economically, and wokeism is leftist because it says everyone should be equal, like in terms of various social identities. And right-wing thought is basically anything that says, well, we can say that some groups or some people are in fact hierarchically speaking greater than others. Like capitalism is inherently right-wing because it basically says, well, not everyone gets to have the same amount. Some people have more than others. You know? So
The thing
and
about wokeism,
various forms of nationalism are right-wing.
right?
So
But
yeah, that's kind of
I
my definition of right and left.
I think woke progressives are oddly, kind of sub-nationalistic in their own way, in a way that kind of repurposes and exalts hierarchy of a racial sort, but just kind of in the opposite way a classic racist would.
The way they frame it is in terms
They're
of equity,
not kind of 99% unit, kind of economic equity oriented. That they've moved away from that significantly. They do have a kind of racial pecking order of their own.
well,
Yeah.
their idea from their perspective is that how do I explain it? Their perspective is that like some groups have had more than others, so we need to put the groups that they oppressed on top to kind of make up for their past oppression so that everyone becomes equal. That's their kind of logic. So
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
like,
So
yeah, so they say like, oh yeah,
that's
men have been oppressing women, therefore we need more women in power because men have been oppressing women for too long, and it's not equitable. Or like, oh yeah, whites have been oppressing blacks, so therefore we need to put blacks on whites, on above whites.
okay.
Or like straights have been oppressing gays, therefore we need to put gays above straights to make it equitable. That's the left logic.
Okay, so but the reason that they're not like conservatives then is because there's some kind of explicit expirate or implicit rather expiration date, at which point we don't have to stack the deck in the opposite direction anymore because everyone will
Well, yeah, like once equity is hit, then leftism achieves their goals.
Okay, so that's the $1 million question, right? Do they actually care about any implicit expiration date, or is it just kind of meant to be in perpetuity? Because if it is, then it's just kind of conservatism upside down.
I mean, their idea is that they hope to eventually reach a utopia where everyone is equitable, where everyone is about the same and doesn't have any restrictions on their self-expression.
Okay, yeah. So on a day-to-day level, though, it seems as if they're simply kind of bringing back and kind of reifying racial classification and differential treatment. But when you understand, yeah.
Well, that's the conservative take, but the ideological Turing test.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, Arnold Kling, he basically said, you pass the test if you can state a view that person would state the view on. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to state the view such that a leftist would say, yes, that's my view.
Yeah, steel
man.
Right,
so here's my steel man, or the Turing test, the ideological Turing test of leftism. Okay, so basically there's hierarchies, right? Like some groups have, historically speaking, oppressed others and still currently oppress others. So leftists would say men still have privileges over women, and white people still have privileges over black people and other people of color. And therefore what we're doing is simply pointing that out and then elevating the groups that are being oppressed. And then they'll say, and what they'll say is like, if there are disparities, that's proof of discrimination. So they'll say, oh yeah, the law on its face is colorblind. The law on its face doesn't say we have to treat white people and black people differently. The law says, well, everyone's the same racially. But, and a leftist would say, if we look at the prisons, far more black people go to prison than white people. Therefore, black people are being discriminated against. Or if we look at if we look at capital, white families have more money than black families. Therefore, black families are being discriminated against, or stuff like that. And then or education, right? Like, oh yeah, black students are underrepresented at these schools, Therefore, we
Like,
need
yeah,
to point that out. Yeah.
disparity means racism, right? Just, but they don't. They will acknowledge that, yeah, it's not intentional, but it's still racism because it manifests in differential outcomes.
Well,
Um,
what the leftist would argue is that it's a correction to racism because it's racist to even have disparities. That's their argument, which I believe is completely false, but I'm able to state it in their terms. I just think it's completely wrong.
right. One thing I've wondered about is, for the longest time, capitalists will defend capitalism based on simply different preferences and different ways of life. And I'm a little surprised the left never really glommed onto that, because, wouldn't equality across different domains suggest like a kind of a homogeneity of lifestyle? And yet I don't think them I don't see them as kind of exalting or supporting everyone having the same lifestyle. So
What they support
capitalism
is this idea that everyone should
well
have
together.
the same should have the same opportunity to live their lifestyle no matter what, and that any restriction to that is oppressive. And that's what separates them from the tradcaps. The tradcaps kind of do say, you know, everyone should work towards a common good, but they specify the common good that everyone should work towards. Leftists are like, yeah, everyone should have equality and have equity and to express themselves, and that no one should be treated any differently, no matter, like, you should tolerate anything.
Like, I can imagine a leftism where, instead of trying to get the top 10% of New York high schools to have more blacks and Latinos, they want they want more prisons to have white people. Or they want more certain phenomenon you see at the bottom of society to have more whites.
Right. Although the prison thing, though, I think they're not going to say that, because a lot of them are turning to prison abolition. That's like the new cool thing, where it's like we don't want any prisons at all. So yeah, but I guess the leftist idea is that, like, as long as people are equal, it's fine. Even if it's like equal in suffering. It's like Harrison Bergeron. It's that story. Where everyone, that's kind of the endpoint of leftism. As long as everyone's equal, no one should have more rights than others. It's very Rawlsian too. This idea that if everyone was living under a veil of ignorance, we would all choose to live in an equal society because we don't know the circumstances of our birth.
Well, Rawls didn't suggest equal material outcome. He wasn't. Well, I don't mean the word suggest.
Well, his idea was that we should lessen inequality.
He was agnostic. He was somewhat agnostic on the economic question. He was talking about a political order.
Well, yeah. So like Rawls basically says we should work for a system where you would want to live in if you didn't know the circumstances of your birth. And the idea that Rawls puts is that, well, if you didn't know, then you would try to make it as fair as possible, as equal as possible, just in case you get born in the wrong position.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a brilliant explication of a social contract theory.
Right. I'm not like
role. It's art to liberate people not having a background, though. Just sort of like ex nihilo, Lockean or state of nature theorizing about how we ought to live. So it does, yeah, it's liberalism, absolutely in that way, but sort of like kind of hand waving away or hand waving, kind of putting aside
right.
specific histories, right?
Although it is arguable that humans would choose to live in a non-hierarchical society if they didn't know the circumstances of their birth, because it is possible that some people, like Hobbes's whole argument is that the state of nature is brutish, so therefore people want a sort of hierarchy with Leviathan on top, so that the system works, so that people don't have a life that's nasty or brutish or short. So this idea that So the Rawlsian idea that everyone would just choose, well, Rawls's implication that everyone would just choose, to determine a more equal society isn't true in its it isn't necessarily true in its face.
Well, right. I mean, it's a thought experiment, but it's perfect for a kind of a liberal transactional polity like the U.S. and it clearly
Right.
comes from a kind of a Lockean and Hobbesian to go upstream from that conception of how humans ought to live, right?
How would you describe yourself politically now? You said you were a libertarian. Are you still a libertarian?
Well, I would not. I would say I'm a post-liberal or anything like that. It's not very cool to be a liberal now, but I can't claim to be anything else. I'm a right liberal, I suppose. It's just kind of a sort of informed by naturalism, ed psych, maybe a little West Coast rationalism. Yeah, although I don't.
Are you a fan of David French?
Because although I'm secular, I must have some kind of lingering Christian informed sense of human dignity or something, or I guess you might just call it, a right wing version of secular humanism or something like that. But more.
I talk about that in my piece. So yeah. Well, so are you kind of like David French in a way, or do you disagree with him?
David
French.
Oh, I don't know. I know that he's not liked, but I don't think so. Because
are you a National Review type of guy?
Compared to what? I mean, maybe, yeah, I'd say so. Except that they're fairly neocon on foreign policy, and one thing I've always been consistent on is being somewhat of an isolationist, non-interventionist. So, to the degree,
but you're not like MAGA or PaleoCon.
No, I'm too much of a liberal for that.
All right, it's a pretty interesting mix of politics. I like it. It defies categorization. It defies easy categorization. It's always a good trait to have.
But I think a lot of people now in this, like I said, like I mentioned before, I mean, politics is getting more complicated, and there's more and more that goes into everyone's becoming sort of idiosyncratic. If you're like some kind of very online theory cell or whatever the fuck they'd say.
Right. Everyone's like, I'm actually a Spenglerian, Hoppian, anarcho-primitive, third, I don't know,
yeah.
Whatever. It's like, what are they even talking about anymore?
I think the eco
but that in itself, I believe but here's the thing, that in itself is a symptom of liberalism, ironically speaking, because it's this idea that you create your own identity, that you're just looking at ideologies and collecting kind of identities. So despite the fact that those people hate liberalism, they replicate liberalism. That's my controversial take.
Yeah, at least I'm remember that's what was that the Steven Pinker book, I think it was just called The Blank Slate, came out in 2000, right. 2001. That's sort of the a naturalism for people who are the softest form of secular liberal. Like it acknowledges human nature, but it doesn't go into much detail, and it doesn't break things down by race. I'm probably right around that space. I wouldn't turn kind of racial classification and race thinking into anything pathological, but I pretty much buy Charles Murray and that kind of stuff, and HBD. I just don't think it's as consequential for politics as other people on the atheistic right believe.
There's an interesting essay by Tara Isabella Burton called Post-Liberal Epistemology that I want you to read. I'm gonna send it to you after you hang up. It basically says, what we're seeing today on the right and left is basically a reaction to neoliberalism. On the left, we see people like talk about lived experiences, like the idea that only this person can have this belief. People are not interchangeable. People are not just widgets to be fed into a capitalist machine, right? Or land acknowledgements, this idea that like, oh yeah, the indigenous people of the land have the right to the land. And on the right, we also have land acknowledgments, right? They just call it blood and soil. Like, they're actually the same concept if you think about it.
Yeah, that's what's incredible, right? I mean,
Right.
they're
That's
actually
what that's what that's what that's what. Yeah.
to like kind of deeply historically situated self. That they're both coming to that sort of conclusion.
Right. So,
Yeah,
and what they both
like
have in common,
one
is that it's a reaction to neoliberalism. The idea that we are our identities, that we are rooted in our identities, that indigenous people, have a right to America because they were here first. On the left and on the right, people say, Europe was settled by Europeans, therefore only whites can kind of can settle Europe or even America, they'll say. And so this idea on both the left and the right, this idea is a reaction to neoliberalism. And that is what animates our politics today. Is we can view it as left versus right on one spectrum, but another very useful spectrum to view it on is neoliberals versus anti-neoliberals. And I think that's what's going to define our politics for the next couple of 20 years, probably.
Yeah. That'd be interesting if what liberalism is what liberal capitalism has created is people, all across the political spectrum who are fed up with both liberalism and capitalism, which of course gets back to the
Right.
that Daniel Bell book. I think it was a Daniel Bell, Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. So this stuff has been
right.
thesis there that it generates antipathy to itself, pretty much.
Right. And that's why Carl Schmitt is both on the left and right becoming huge because it's all politics comes down to theology, just people fighting against each other that's what he would say, in an agonistic state. So yeah, good talk today.
Yeah.
I will talk to you later. I'll talk to you on X.
Cool. Yeah, good talk. Take care, man.
All right.